Welcome to EKO201E Economics. I'm Chris Hannum, and this will be lecture 14 on oligopoly. So this will be the last of the 5 lectures, a series of lectures on the behavior of the firm and market structure and how those are interrelated. We talked in the previous lecture about one intermediate market structure, one that isn't quite perfectly competitive, but has some competition and isn't a true monopoly in monopolistic competition. Today we're going to talk about a second intermediary market structure that has some competition, but not as much competition as a perfectly competitive industry would have. This is the case of oligopoly, where the number of firms is small, not infinite as it would need to be with a perfectly competitive market structure, but not one. One, as in the case of a pure monopoly, enables that one firm to really control the market price, to choose whatever price they want to charge, limited only by consumers' willingness to pay. In the case of an oligopoly, where we have a small number of firms, those firms still have the ability to influence the price, but that isn't the same as simply choosing it. First, we'll talk about how to measure whether a market is or is not an oligopoly. It's easy to tell whether a market is or is not genuinely a monopoly simply by looking at whether there is one firm or more than one firm, many firms. But in order to determine whether we would classify an industry as an oligopoly, it's necessary to know whether the number of firms is small. And the number of firms being small is a bit of an ambiguous concept. So first, we define something called a concentration ratio, which we would use to measure how concentrated that market is. That is to say, how powerful, how important the largest firms in that industry are. Now, then we would use this concentration ratio to determine some kind of a threshold. So if the market is this concentrated, then we'll classify it as an oligopoly. But if it's less concentrated than that, so the largest firms in this industry have less market share and market power, then we would classify it as not an oligopoly, or not an oligopoly to the extent that we might need to worry about the economic harm that comes about from an oligopoly and need to think about public policy solutions, which we'll get to toward the end of this lecture. Now, that concentration ratio should logically rise when there's less competition, fewer firms, larger firms, and fall when there is more competition, more firms, smaller firms. Now, the way we calculate this concentration ratio, we take on the one hand, the market share is the total amount of output by that firm in the industry divided by the total output for the market as a whole. And what we're looking at is a concentration for the largest 4 firms. These 4 firms, what is their combined market share? Is their combined market share 20% of the entire market? Is their combined market share 40%, 60%, 80%? And this is the measure that we would use to determine whether or not our market was too concentrated, to set this threshold to determine whether or not it was an oligopoly. Here we have a table of some examples of concentration ratios. That is the percentage of the entire market which is taken up by the 4 largest firms. As you can see, at that time, in both the video game console industry, where we have a small number of large firms producing products like the Xbox or PlayStation, and in the tennis ball industry, we have 100% concentration ratios. That is to say, either we have 4 firms that together make up all of the market output, or we have fewer than 4 firms, of course, which also make up all of market output. And if we go down the list just a bit, we come to, for example, credit cards with 99% concentration ratio. That is to say that the largest 4 firms in the credit card industry make up 99% of total market output of credit cards. But there is at least one firm, a 5th firm perhaps, that makes up the further 1% of that market output. So those 4 firms don't completely control that market, but those 4 firms are certainly dominant in that market. Going on down the list, we find that even in the automobile industry, where there are far more than 4 firms in the United States, the largest 4 firms have a concentration ratio of 70%. That is, 70% of total output in the automobile industry comes from the largest 4 automobile manufacturing firms in the United States. Now, in all of these cases, we might say that these concentration ratios rise above the threshold that we would use to say that this industry is an oligopoly, that the concentration is too high, the level of competition is too low, and we might require some form of public policy to remedy that kind of a situation. Now, if we classify this market as having a high concentration ratio, few large firms, therefore an oligopoly, what is it exactly that we mean by an oligopoly in a theoretical context? How do we expect these firms to behave given that they are an oligopoly? Or how do we expect the market to work given that these firms are an oligopoly? Now, the key thing to bear in mind here, we can assume that if the industry is an oligopoly, we could have firms that make identical products, as in the case of perfect competition, or we could assume that these products are slightly differentiated in the versions that these individual firms make, just like we would in monopolistic competition, because this aspect isn't crucial to how firms would be expected to behave in an oligopoly. Now, the crucial thing is that the number of firms should be small, and that number of firms should be limited. That is, there should be some barrier to entry keeping other firms out, therefore maintaining a small number of firms. Otherwise, we could have a small number of firms in, say, a monopolistically competitive industry for no reason other than a lack of demand and profitability in that industry. But we wouldn't expect those firms to, over the long run, necessarily behave like an oligopoly. Now, the key distinction to make in behavior of an oligopolistic firm, that is, a firm in an industry that has an oligopoly, is that these firms' decisions are critically dependent on decisions made by other firms. So the actions of one single other firm have a clear impact on how much one firm will be able to sell or what price one firm will be able to charge. And whether it's desirable for one firm in an oligopolistic industry, say Sony, which produces a PlayStation 4, which, as we established, is part of an oligopolistic video game console industry. Their decision to raise the price may or may not be a good idea, depending on the reaction of their competitors in that oligopolistic industry, such as Microsoft, producers of Xboxes. Now, this is something which monopolies need never consider because they have no competition, and monopolistically competitive and perfectly competitive firms also don't need to consider because the number of competitors that they have is so large, or so potentially large, that they can't really devote much time to analyzing the effects of their actions on any of those individual competitors or trying to predict what any of those individual competitors will do. In the case of an oligopoly, the number of competitors that a firm such as Sony in the video game console market has is quite small. And they can devote a lot of time and energy to trying to figure out exactly how those firms will react, or to trying to figure out exactly what those firms' plans for the next quarter, for the next year might be. We refer to this kind of decision-making by these oligopolistic firms as strategic behavior. That is, they need to carefully consider when planning a decision, not just the effects on them of their decision, but the reaction of other firms and how they might plan to react to various things that other firms might do. And if they plan to react in a certain way, whether other firms might expect those reactions and how that might influence those other firms' decisions. Generally speaking, when we look at an oligopoly, and especially a duopoly, the theoretical framework that we use to describe this kind of decision-making process, and what these firms will decide to do, how they will decide to react, what kind of reactions they will expect, is called game theory. This is modeling or describing this kind of behavior as though these were participants in a game. And we'll get into in a few minutes how we use this game theoretical approach to explain and describe oligopoly behavior. Now first, let's produce a simple example in an industry that's likely to be an oligopoly anywhere in the world, which is cell phone service. Suppose we have one small town, and in that small town, called small town, we have two cell phone providers. If we have only two, that form of an oligopoly is called a duopoly. And suppose these individual firms producing cell phone service in small town have a potential customer base of 140 people. There are 140 residents in this small town. So there's no way that they can expand their output, expand their production beyond 140. And the question is, how many of these 140 people will be willing to buy cell phone service at all? So, based on the basic law of demand, we would expect that as the price of cell phone service, even if cell phone service is considered something like a necessity, as the price rises, the quantity demanded would fall. Perhaps if it was free, all 140 people living in small town would choose to have cell phone service. But if the price were to rise to, say, 30, only 80 of those 140 people would be willing to pay that much for that service. Next, the good in this case we'll assume is identical. Now in reality, the cell phone service that's provided by two different companies might not be quite exactly the same. You might have differences in network quality. You might find that in one corner of your apartment, one cell phone service provider has good reception while another cell phone service provider doesn't. But for simplicity's sake, we'll just assume that this service is not different. And we don't have one person preferring one company and another person preferring another company. Just for simplicity's sake, in this simple example. Now, we can see a demand schedule here to the left, which represents the entirety of market demand. This isn't quite the same as the demand schedule that one individual firm would face if that one individual firm has competition, either in a perfectly competitive industry or in this case, in a duopoly, where these two cell phone service providers compete with one another and only one another. Nonetheless, we could say that if both of these firms that are the only service providers for cell phone service in this town, if they both charge a price of 0, then 140 people will be willing to purchase this product at a price of 0. But we wouldn't be able to say anything necessarily about which of those service providers they would choose. If we had a price of 20, which was charged by both of these cell phone service providers, we could say, given this market demand schedule, that 100 of those 140 people would be willing to pay 20 and would purchase this cell phone service, but we wouldn't be able to say anything at all about which of those cell phone service providers they would choose. For our purposes, this could be effectively random, or we could simply imagine that they each buy, or each take up 50% of that market, and each get a 50% share. Now next, as the last part of our assumptions in building this simple model of a duopoly, imagine that these firms have a constant marginal cost to provide one additional line of cell phone service, a constant marginal cost of 10. So if they can get a price of at least 10, it could be profitable for this firm to sell cell phone service to that additional customer. Logically, these firms don't have a zero marginal cost, a zero cost. It's never going to be worthwhile for them to charge nothing. Now, if this was a competitive industry and we had a constant marginal cost, we can establish that in a long-run equilibrium, we would naturally expect that competitive industry to have a market price equal to marginal cost. So that competitive industry, if these firms behaved like a competitive industry, a perfectly competitive industry, would have a price equal to 10, with marginal cost being 10. And with a price of 10, 120 people would purchase cell phone service. perhaps 60 for each of these two cell phone service providers. Now, if we do have each of these firms selling 60 cell phone service plans at a price of 10, splitting that market equally, then they would have a total revenue of 600 each, or a total revenue for the entire market of 1,200. But because their marginal cost per unit is 10, that would mean that the total profit in this industry was 0. 600 cost and 600 revenue for each firm. 0 economic profit, just as we described before, is what we would expect to be the base case in a perfectly competitive industry. So if these firms behave like perfectly competitive firms, they're not profitable. Just like perfectly competitive firms are not profitable. But now suppose, on the other hand, that these firms might behave like a monopoly. Suppose that there was only one of these firms and the other one went away, or they merged and they were managed as one. What price then would that monopoly choose to charge? What price would make total profits in this industry as high as they could possibly be? Now, if we look at this schedule here, we can calculate what price times quantity or total revenue is for the total industry. And total revenue rises and rises and rises to hit a maximum of 2,450 if we were to charge a price of 35 and have a quantity sold of 70 at the entire industry level. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that a price of 35 and a quantity of 70 is the profit maximizing quantity of output or the profit maximizing price if this oligopoly were to behave like a monopoly or through a merger they were to become a monopoly. Remember that we've assumed that the marginal cost for these firms to provide one more line, to provide cell phone service to one more resident of this town, is 10. So as they decrease the quantity of output from, say, 70 to 60, their cost would fall from 700 to 600. As this firm, we assume this is a monopoly created through a merger of our duopoly, as this monopoly increases the price from 35 to 40 and decreases the quantity that they produce from 70 to 60, we see that their total revenue falls. It falls by 50, from 2,450 to 2,400. But their cost also falls. The cost falls from 700 to 600. So their profit, which is the difference between those two, is now 2,400 minus 600, 1,800, 50 greater than their profit would have been with a price of 35 and a quantity sold of 70. So if we have a firm that behaves like an oligopoly or an industry that behaves like a monopoly, we would expect them to choose to charge a price of 40, choose to produce a quantity of 60, because this is the price and quantity combination that would make their profit, as illustrated in the table on the slide, as high as it could possibly be at 1,800. So now we can distinguish here between a perfectly competitive outcome for the same industry with a price of 0. If these duopolists were to compete with one another to the extent that firms in a perfectly competitive industry compete with one another and have 0 economic profit, versus if these two firms were to behave as a monopoly did. If they were to behave as a monopoly did, they would charge a price of 40, and the market quantity would be 60. Now, if they're not a monopoly, they're just duopolists who agree simultaneously to charge a price of 40, as an entire industry, profits would be 1,800. We couldn't say anything in particular about how that total market demand quantity of 60 would be divided between the two firms, or how that profit would be split between the two firms. Maybe it would be split down the middle, 900 to each of those firms, maybe not. But clearly, both of those firms should be better off if they had behaved like a monopoly than if they had behaved like a perfectly competitive firm in a perfectly competitive industry would. No, while we say this outcome, if these firms were to behave like a monopoly, seems to be good for those firms, that definitely does not mean that this outcome would be good for society. Just like a monopoly is bad for society. They produce too little. They charge a price which is too high. They cause inefficiencies and deadweight loss. So we would try to remedy that kind of a problem through public policy. Oligopolies behaving like a monopoly cause the same problems for society. They hurt consumers by charging prices which are very high. They hurt the economy as a whole by producing too little of that good. And they fail to maximally efficiently utilize resources. So we would want to remedy that kind of oligopoly behavior through the same kind of public policy that we want to remedy monopoly behavior. But monopoly is good for that monopolistic firm. And for an oligopoly to behave like a monopoly is good for those oligopolistic firms. It's just very bad for everyone else. So bad for everyone else that it's bad for society as a whole. Now, the special term in the case of an oligopoly that we would use to describe this kind of behavior, where we have more than one firm, but they behave as though they were a monopoly, and they charge that same price that a monopolist would charge, and they somehow agree to divide up the market between them, we call that collusion. A collusion would be some kind of meeting behind closed doors between the owners or managers of different firms in an oligopoly, where they simultaneously agree on what price they will charge and agree on what kind of a quantity that they will produce. And if they have a sustained collusion, sustained group of firms in that oligopoly that continue to collude over time, we call that a cartel. Now, real cartels and explicit collusion, their open collusion or sustained collusion over time, isn't actually all that common, but it's certainly not unheard of. The most important, famous real cartel, an oligopolistic industry, where these firms are able to maintain this kind of collusion over time, is OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Because, of course, where public policy could intervene and try to do something about this sort of behavior between different firms within a country, there isn't really any equivalent for some kind of a body that could regulate the behavior of nations. So in our example, we could imagine that these two firms in the small-town cell phone industry, which we've imagined are the dominant American cell phone providers, cell phone service providers, AT&T and Verizon. We could just as easily label Vodafone and Turkcell. These two firms agree amongst themselves, they have some meeting behind closed doors, and they agree that they will both charge the same price, and that price will be 40, and that they will both produce the same quantity, that is, offer the same number of cell phone service plans up to individuals living in that town of 30. No one will take 31, no one will be stuck with only 29. They agree on this, and if they do that, they will each get 900 profit. And they might agree to that because 900 is clearly better than 0 for them. So colluding is better than competing for them. Or colluding is better than a result in which they would receive 0 profit. And the other thing to bear in mind when we're talking about an oligopoly is that although there is a desire by these firms to collude and to behave like a monopoly would behave, to get the same market outcome, which is best for the firms, higher price, lower quantity, such that marginal revenue equals marginal cost for the entire industry. It's difficult for firms in an oligopolistic industry to do this because they have a natural desire to compete with one another. They're self-interested, just like a monopolist is self-interested. But that self-interest can lead them to collude, and it can also lead them to cheat, to back out on whatever agreements that they have made with other parties in that cartel, if they believe that it might be in their self-interest to do so. So suppose here that these two firms in this small town example, they've both agreed to charge a price of 40, and they both agreed to produce a quantity of 30. Now suppose that one of these firms believes that the other one will hold to the agreement, but considers maybe producing a quantity that's just a little bit greater than 30 and seeing if they can capture just a little bit extra of that market. So suppose that AT&T, one of those firms, AT&T, who has promised to produce only 30, provide only 30 subscriptions, decides to produce 40 instead. Now, if they produce 40 instead, they could look at that market demand schedule and they could see that that would cause the market price to fall. Of course, oligopolists are still fairly large relative to the entire market, so decisions they make do have an impact on market price, unlike in a perfectly competitive industry. Now, if they do that, then the market quantity will be 70, and people will only be willing to charge or pay a price of 35. They'll only be able to charge a price of 35 for all of those cell phone service plans. Now, if AT&T does that, then the revenues that they would get would be 35 times 40. But the revenues that their competitor Verizon would get, if Verizon held to their original bargain that they made with AT&T, would be that Verizon would be still producing a quantity of 30, yet AT&T would have driven down the market price to 35. So Verizon would be getting a total revenue of 35 times 30 instead of 35 times 40. So in this case, AT&T might find that their profit rises as they increase their quantity of output from 30 to 40, even though the market price falls. And as the market price falls, we already established, they had chosen a market price and market quantity combination that gave the most profit to the industry as a whole. So for AT&T's profit to be rising by reneging on this agreement, cheating, by betraying their competitor, Verizon, in the market, for their profit to rise, it must be the case that Verizon's profit falls, and it must fall by more than AT&T's profit rises. Note that if it's in AT&T's best interest to cheat, for AT&T's best interest to not follow that agreement and produce 40 instead of 30, if they expect that Verizon is still going to produce 30, we imagine that these firms are identical, that their costs are the same, their product is the same. They had originally decided to divide up that market exactly equally. And if it's in AT&T's best interest to do that, it should be in Verizon's best interest to do that too. So both of these firms would face the same incentives to cheat on that original deal that they'd made, where they made an original deal to produce 30, which would allow them both to charge a price of 40, which would allow them both to earn a profit of 900. But they would have the incentive each to increase the quantity that they produced to 40, in the hopes that if the other maintained a quantity of output of 30, they would be able to sell those 40 units for 35, and they would have a higher profit than they would if they'd maintained the original agreement. But the result, if they both produce 40, is that the market quantity will now be 80, and the market price will fall not to 35, the market price will fall to 30. Now, for each of these firms, if they're selling 40 at a price of 30, they have a total revenue of 1,200. And if they're producing 40 with a marginal cost of 10, they have a total cost of 400. So that total revenue of 1,200 minus a cost of 400 gives each of these firms a profit of 800. So this is what happens when these firms fail to collude, because they're both following their self-interest. They're both hoping that the other firm will maintain their end of the bargain, that the other firm has promised to produce only 30, so they don't hold their promise, they produce 40, and this other firm doesn't hold their promise, they also produce 40. When both fail to hold their promise, both see their profits reduced relative to what their profits would have been in that collusive outcome. So now, if both firms are going to cheat, should that affect their desire to cheat, that expectation that the other firm would cheat? Now note, we said that if both of these firms cheat, both of these firms produce 40 instead of 30, forcing the price down to 30, both of them have a profit of 800. So now what would happen if AT&T cheats, but Verizon does not? So for Verizon is producing only 30, they're charging a price of 35, so their total revenue is 1,050. So Verizon is charging a price of 35, maximum price the market will bear, and selling a quantity of 30, which gives them a total revenue of 1,050. And by producing 30 units with a marginal cost of 10, Verizon has a total cost of 300. This gives Verizon a profit of 750, 1,050 minus 300. And that profit of 750, if Verizon holds to the agreement, while AT&T does not, is worse than if Verizon had also cheated, had also reneged on the deal, had also increased the quantity that they produced to 40. So in this case, whether Verizon expects AT&T to hold their agreement, or whether Verizon expects AT&T to cheat, whether they expect AT&T to produce 30 or 40, it's always going to be in the best interest of Verizon to produce a quantity of 40, which would give them a profit of 800 instead of 750, or increase their profit above 900 if they expect that AT&T does not renege on the deal. The lesson from the example is that both of these firms do have some desire to collude, that clearly as compared to a competitive outcome, a perfectly competitive outcome where they would earn zero profit, they're both much better off colluding and charging the price a monopoly would charge. They're also better off if they cheat a little bit on that agreement and charge still higher prices than marginal cost, higher prices than perfectly competitive firms would charge. Now, they're both best off if they both stick to the cartel agreement. That is to say, they're better off than they would be if neither one of them stuck to that cartel agreement. But neither one actually has the incentive to stick to that agreement. In this case, no matter what the other firm does. The only way in which they would have the incentive to stick to that cartel agreement was if they could expect the other competitor in that industry to hold to the agreement if and only if they also held to their end of the agreement. That is to say, if there was some form of a binding contract, which we can't in the real world have, because policy forbids this, law forbids this, in that case, we might be able to see a sustained collusion or cartel over time without firms incrementally increasing the amount that they produce and cheating on that or reneging on that agreement. Next to look at, would an oligopoly, given that it's very difficult for these firms to collude, would firms in an oligopoly ultimately continue to reduce their price further and further and further until they reached this perfectly competitive equilibrium? And the answer is no. Firms in an oligopoly still have market power, they still have the ability to influence the price, and the effect that their quantity decisions have on the price does still give them an incentive to keep prices high, even though they're forced to compete with other firms in that industry. If we can look at that simple example, small town cell phone service provider example, we could look for an example, what would happen if a firm AT&T or the firm Verizon were to increase their quantity of output further, from 40 to 50 instead of 30 to 40. Now, if just one firm, say Verizon, decides to increase its output from 40 to 50, from that non-collusive level we had before, that level where both firms were producing 40, both firms were earning 800 in profit. Suppose just one of those firms decides to increase their output to 50. Market quantity of output would become 90. This would push down the market price to 25. And now that one firm which decided to produce 50 instead of 40, they would see that their total revenue was 50 times 25, or 1,250. And that firm would see that their total cost, which is a marginal cost of 10 times a quantity of output of 50, rose to 500, and that firm would see that their profit goes from 800 if they produce only 40 units to 750 if they decide to produce 50. In this case, the decrease in the price as they increase their output from 40 to 50 is sufficient to cause that single firm's profits to fall, even if their competitor does not change their quantity of output and continues to produce 40 units. Logically, that competitor, who's producing only 40 units, would also see their profits fall when one firm increases output to 50, pushes the market price down to 25. So in this case, decreasing the price to 25 by increasing the quantity to 50 would not be desirable for either firm. So in this case, we would have a market equilibrium in this industry where both of these firms decide to produce 40 but are not willing to produce more. So a market equilibrium, in an oligopoly in this case, would be a market quantity of 80 and a market price of 30. Next, we want to introduce some concepts from game theory that we may use to analyze a market which is an oligopoly. When we talk about game theory, we use a different concept of equilibrium than we do in supply and demand, for example, where supply and demand intersect. We describe a situation as being a Nash equilibrium in a game as a combination of strategies where neither player in this game would prefer to have made a different decision given the decision that the second player in the game, the competitor or opponent in the game, ultimately decided or made. If that's true for both players in the game, given the other player's decision, they would not prefer to have made a different decision, then the outcome is a Nash equilibrium. And in this small town cell phone duopoly case, we have a Nash equilibrium with a quantity of output of 30. If we imagine that the options that are available to each of these firms are quantity of 30, quantity of 40, and quantity of 50. If both firms produce 40, then given that the other firm produces 40, neither firm would prefer to have produced 30 or prefer to have produced 50. So that outcome would be a Nash equilibrium. Next to note that this outcome, as illustrated in the small town duopoly example in an oligopoly, gave us a price of 30 at this Nash equilibrium, which is much higher than the perfectly competitive market equilibrium price would have been of only 10, where price equaled marginal cost. And the quantity of output was only 80. The quantity of output was not 120. So here we definitely have a lower quantity of output produced and a higher price charged in an oligopoly, even though they're competing with one another, than we would in a perfectly competitive industry. And that means we do have deadweight loss, we do have inefficiency in an oligopoly that we don't have in a perfectly competitive industry. But as compared to a monopoly, we see a lower price charged in an oligopoly because they're forced to compete with one another, and we see a higher market output of 80 instead of 60 compared to what we would have seen in a monopoly. So compared to a monopoly, the oligopoly deadweight loss, or the oligopoly inefficiency, is a bit lower. And the larger the number of firms in this industry, the closer the outcome in that oligopoly would ultimately be to the perfectly competitive outcome. And the farther away it would become from the monopoly outcome, the lower the deadweight loss would be in an oligopoly with, say, 10 firms as opposed to 2. Now, whether we look at an oligopoly or we look at a monopoly, at any firm with market power, we could say that when these firms increase their output because they push down the market price, this has two different impacts that we can classify in a different way on their profitability. It has first an output effect that by producing more, they can capture more of that overall market and increase their profit, but they also have a price effect that they push down the market price when they produce more output, and therefore they decrease their profit. And whether they would choose to produce more or choose to produce less, whether they're an oligopoly or whether they're a monopoly. For any firm with market power, therefore some impact on the price, whether they would choose to produce more would depend on which of those two effects had a larger effect in this particular case on their profit. If the output effect outweighs the price effect, they'll choose to produce more. If the price effect outweighs the output effect, they would choose to produce less. Now, as I mentioned, when we have an oligopoly, it does create deadweight loss, but oligopolies with a larger number of firms ultimately are forced to compete with them more. They have less of an incentive to try to keep the price high because they have more competitors who might in turn be pushing the price down. And the more firms we have in an oligopoly, the closer the ultimate outcome winds up being to a perfectly competitive outcome. We'll still have some inefficiency, we'll still have some deadweight loss, but we'll have much less than we would if we had, say, a duopoly. Now, this is actually another one of those main arguments in favor of international trade. Now, in addition to the idea that we might be able to buy certain goods from abroad for less, as we talked about many lectures ago, if we have an oligopoly at home, only 2 or 3 firms, and we have an oligopoly in a foreign country, only 2 or 3 companies in that industry there, when we open international trade between those 2 countries in that product, suddenly we have a combined market between those countries with 5 or 6 firms instead of 2 or 3. So all of those firms, although it's still a larger oligopoly, they face more competition and they begin to behave a bit more like a perfectly competitive industry and a bit less like a monopoly, and deadweight loss decreases. Next, what we want to do is to present another kind of example using game theory explicitly, where we can describe specific decisions that firms need to make and what they need to take into account when they make those kinds of decisions. Now, in game theory, we try to plot out what the impacts of different strategies would be for players in the game, or the impact of a different strategy, say to charge a price of 40 or to produce a quantity of 30, would be for that particular oligopolistic firm who is playing the game against other oligopolistic firms. And note, when we talk about outcomes in a game theory, we frame these outcomes as payoffs for the specific firm. That payoff would be like the profit for the firm in our small town example of 900 instead of 800, or 800 instead of 750. That's their payoff to that outcome in the game. We don't talk in game theoretical examples about whether or not a firm or a player wins the game. So it doesn't matter if one firm has a higher payoff than another firm does. That doesn't mean that that firm wins the game. What they should be striving for is a higher payoff rather than a greater payoff than their competitor gets. Next, we say that what a firm does in the game we call a strategy, and we say that something is a dominant strategy in game theory if it's something that's always the best strategy to do. In that example that we just made, small town cell phone duopoly with AT&T and Verizon. AT&T and Verizon have a dominant strategy each to produce a quantity of 40. It's a dominant strategy because whether or not it's desirable for them to do that doesn't depend on what their opponent does. They wouldn't prefer to do it in some circumstances, but not in others. They would always prefer to follow that strategy, no matter what their opponent did in that game. And also here, in our simple form of a game theoretical model, we're assuming that each of these firms will make their decisions simultaneously, or players in the game will choose a strategy simultaneously, but they won't be able to impact the strategy that the other follows because they're made simultaneously. If they could discuss and agree what they might do beforehand, any agreement that they make can't be binding. They can't be compelled to follow it when they ultimately do choose a strategy for the game. Now, this is different to how many actual games would work in the real world, such as chess. in which case different players in that game choose a strategy or make a move sequentially as opposed to simultaneously, so one could see what the other did and react accordingly. In our example, we assume that that's not possible because we assume that these decisions are made simultaneously. Now, the first example for a game theoretical scenario that we'll look at is a common textbook case that's called the prisoner's dilemma. The scenario that's presented in the prisoner's dilemma is that we imagine that two individuals have committed a crime, and both individuals have been arrested, and those two individuals are being questioned by the police simultaneously but separately. Now, if one or both of those individuals confesses that they committed the crime, then the police will have the necessary evidence to convict them for that crime. But if they don't, that is, if neither one of those people confesses to the crime, then in our scenario, the police don't have enough evidence to convict them. But the police do have enough evidence to convict them for a minor crime. Say in our example, we might imagine that these two individuals have robbed a bank, and that they've robbed that bank while possessing an illegal firearm. Now, the police, without a confession, may not be able to prove that they robbed the bank, but they can easily prove that they were in possession of an illegal firearm, and they can punish them for that. But the punishment for having an illegal firearm is small, and the punishment for robbing a bank would be high. Now, in this prisoner's dilemma example, we imagine that the two criminals, rather than the police, are the players in the game, and that each of them have two potential strategies in this game that they could choose, and that they need to choose them simultaneously and separately. Both could choose confess or stay silent and refuse to confess. In this example, we imagine one criminal is named Bonnie, the other criminal is named Clyde, but it's not particularly important what names we give these two criminals. Note that the police are not players in this game, but the police determine what the payoffs would be. The police determine that the payoff, if both individuals stay silent, so the police are not able to convict anyone for that crime, the payoff is still a negative because they will convict these two individuals for possession of an illegal firearm or some other kind of minor crime. Now, if one person confesses and the other person does not, the police choose what these payoffs will be, and they choose them in order to try to convince that individual to confess. They offer that individual, if they confess and say that it was all the other person's fault, and give them the evidence they need to convict that other person of robbing the bank, that the person who confesses, if they're the only one who confesses, won't be punished at all. They will be allowed to go free. And the only person who's punished, who will be punished severely, is the person who refused to confess. On the other hand, if both of them confess, then their individual testimonies in court aren't as valuable. And if both of them confess, then they will both be punished for robbing that bank. Their punishment will be much more severe than the punishment would have been just for possessing an illegal firearm. But their punishment will not be as severe as it would be if they hadn't confessed, but the other partner in crime had and had blamed everything on them. Now, what we can look at here on the slide is what we describe as a payoff matrix. That payoff matrix describes the payoffs for the two players in the game under 4, in this case, scenarios. The first scenario will be that Clyde confesses and Bonnie also confesses. Confess. And this gives the payoff to Clyde in this situation and also the payoff to Bonnie in this situation. And if both confess, then we assume that both are punished with 8 years in prison for robbing the bank. Now the second, just below potential scenario, the second of our 4 potential outcomes in our payoff matrix is if Clyde does not confess, he remains silent, but Bonnie does confess. Now the outcome in this case is that Clyde is punished severely. He's able to be convicted for robbing the bank based on Bonnie's testimony in court. He gets 20 years in prison, and Bonnie gets no prison at all. She gets off free by blaming Clyde for everything. Now, the third potential outcome in our payoff matrix is in the upper right corner. That's if Clyde is the one who confesses and Bonnie is the one who remains silent. Now, here the outcome is the same as in the second case, but reversed. Now, Bonnie is the one who spends 20 years in prison, and Clyde is the one who doesn't go to prison at all by testifying in court against Bonnie and blaming everything on her. And then the fourth outcome, in the lower right corner, that fourth outcome is what we would have, the payoffs that we would have for Bonnie and for Clyde if both of them remain silent. So both of them refuse to confess, and they're both punished for the possession of an illegal firearm, and they both get 1 year in prison, not 8 and not 20. Now, in this case, what should Bonnie choose to do, or what should Clyde choose to do? So what Clyde would choose to do, given that Clyde has no idea in this other room in the police station what Bonnie is doing, is to look at if Bonnie has already confessed, what is his best available option? And if Bonnie has not already confessed, since he doesn't know, what is his best available option? And Clyde would see that if Bonnie has already confessed, and he doesn't know whether she has or not, if she's already confessed, then he has the choice either to also confess and get a sentence of 8 years, or to refuse to confess and get blamed for everything and go to jail for 20 years. So if he thinks that probably Bonnie has already confessed, he doesn't know, but if he thinks that Bonnie has probably already confessed, he would see that his best option is to also confess and take 8 years in prison instead of 20. Again, he doesn't know if Bonnie has confessed or not, so he also needs to consider what his best option would be if Bonnie has not confessed. Then he would consider if Bonnie has not confessed and I also don't confess, then we could avoid any punishment for robbing this bank. They'll never know we did it, but we'll both be punished for having this illegal firearm, and I'll go to jail for 1 year. But if Bonnie does not confess, if he thinks that Bonnie has remained silent, and he does confess, now in that case, they will know that they robbed that bank, but Bonnie's the only one who'll be punished. He can testify in court against Bonnie, see her go to jail for 20 years, and he'll go free. His punishment will be 0. So he would compare 0 years of prison to 1 year of prison, and Clyde would say that if he believes that Bonnie is silent or will remain silent, his best option is to confess, to blame everything on Bonnie. So for Clyde, his best option is to confess if Bonnie confesses, and his best option is to confess if Bonnie doesn't confess. So his best option is always to confess. Confess is his dominant strategy. Now, unfortunately for Clyde, Bonnie has exactly the same payoffs as he does, just a mirror version of his payoffs in this payoff matrix. So Bonnie's best option, if Clyde confesses, would be also to confess. And Bonnie's best option, if Clyde remains silent, would also be to confess. She would prefer 0 years of prison to 1, and she would prefer 8 years of prison to 20. So given that she has no idea what Clyde has done and no ability to control what Clyde is going to do, she has a dominant strategy to confess, just like he does. Now, what we expect in a game theory type model is that if both players have dominant strategies, both players will follow those dominant strategies. And furthermore, both players should expect the other player to follow that player's dominant strategy. So here, both players would confess, and both players furthermore would expect the other player in this game, the other person who's being interrogated in the other room of this police station, to confess. So our Nash equilibrium, which is a dominant strategy equilibrium in this particular game theory scenario, in the prisoner's dilemma, is that both of these criminals confess. When both of these criminals confess, they both go to prison for 8 years. That's what we would expect them naturally to do based on the payoffs that they see. This is the best option available to them. But clearly, the best combined outcome for both of these people is not for both of them to confess. They're both clearly much worse off than if they could have both just remained silent, because the police did not have enough evidence to convict either of them for robbing the bank if neither of them confessed to that crime. But because there's nothing they can do to induce the other person to stay silent, because their decision to stay silent isn't bound to the other person's decision to stay silent. Both of them have a strong incentive, no matter what the other person might be doing, to confess. And we wind up with a Nash equilibrium, which is clearly worse for both players of the game than some equilibrium could be, wherein both of them choose to stay silent. And the question again, why is it that they don't both just stay silent? Well, if one of them agreed beforehand to stay silent and they kept to that agreement, the other person would still have a strong incentive, while believing and trusting that that person would stay silent, to sell them out, to confess, to tell the police that the other person is to blame for everything in order to go to prison for 0 years instead of the 1. Of course, the prisoner's dilemma example usually with Bonnie and Clyde, who robbed a bank and are being interrogated by police, might superficially appear to have very little to do with oligopoly. This is just a common textbook example of a specific scenario in which two players in a game could choose an outcome which appeared to be mutually beneficial, but they clearly have a disincentive to do so. And the Nash equilibrium of this game, of any game which we categorize as being similar to a prisoner's dilemma, we'll call a prisoner's dilemma type game, is an outcome which is worse for both parties, even though that decision, the strategy that they follow, is individually optimal. They follow dominant strategies to an outcome that is ruinous for both. So the case of Bonnie and Clyde gets both of them arrested, both of them convicted for robbing a bank. But as you could see, if we were to take that small-town duopoly AT&T and Verizon example and convert that to a game theoretical model with a payoff matrix, and the decisions that these firms make now are decisions about quantity of output, 40 or 30. The two players in the game are those two companies. And instead of police helping to determine the shape of that payoff matrix and what the payoffs are, now we have consumers in demand helping to determine what exactly the payoffs will be. Just as in the case of the payoff matrix for the prisoner's dilemma with Bonnie and Clyde, this prisoner's dilemma type oligopoly model, like that small-town duopoly model with AT&T and Verizon, we see that both firms have the incentive to produce a large quantity of output, 40 rather than 30, even though the Nash equilibrium that gives us is worse for both firms than they would have had if they had both decided to produce a small quantity of output, such as 30. Exactly the same as in that prisoner's dilemma example with Bonnie and Clyde, where both would have been better off if both had stayed silent than both are if they both confess. Here, AT&T and Verizon would both be better off with a quantity of 30 than they would be with a quantity of 40, yet quantity of 30 is not a Nash equilibrium. It's not a Nash equilibrium because given that one firm produces 30, the other firm would prefer, in retrospect, to have made a different decision, followed a different strategy, and produced 40 instead of 30. It doesn't meet our definition for a Nash equilibrium, and it would not be sustainable because it's not compatible with the incentives that these firms or these players in the game face. Now, in addition to that simple small-town cell phone duopoly quantity competition example, we have other examples of oligopoly-type behavior or behavior outside of oligopolies that fit this basic prisoner's dilemma scenario, where firms have a dominant strategy. Both firms in that duopoly, or both firms in that game, have a dominant strategy, and when both firms follow that dominant strategy, the outcome is worse for both firms than it would have been if both had done something else. The next will be what we call the fair wars game. Here we have oligopolists that are competing with differentiated products by choosing prices that they will charge, not by choosing a quantity of output that would drive the market price down. Here in our fair wars game, we suppose that the two players in the game, the two duopolists that are competing with one another, are airlines. And both airlines are faced with a choice to keep prices high or to cut prices and try to take customers away from the other airline. Now, if both airlines cut fares, then we assume that both airlines' profits will be 400. If we assume that both airlines keep fares high, obviously they're selling for higher prices, so we assume that both firms have profits of 600. Clearly it would be better for both firms to keep prices high than it would be for both firms to cut their prices, but if only one firm cuts its prices, that firm gets 800. And if the other firm does not cut prices, that firm has a profit of only 200. We can draw out that payoff matrix and look at what firms would choose to do. What firms would choose to do, what, say, Delta Airlines would choose to do if United Airlines chooses to keep prices high, or what Delta Airlines would do if Delta Airlines cut their prices. And we see that the outcome is a dominant strategy of cutting fares for both Delta Airlines and for United Airlines. If Delta Airlines cuts their fares and United Airlines does not, then Delta Airlines gets a profit of 800 instead of 600. And if Delta Airlines cuts their fares and United Airlines also cuts their fares, then Delta Airlines would have a profit of 400 as opposed to a profit of 200 if Delta had made a different decision, but United Airlines had still cut their fares. The dominant strategy for both is to cut fares, but when both cut fares, the outcome is clearly worse for both oligopolists than it would have been if both firms had kept prices high. Now, in this case, whether oligopoly firms are competing on quantity or whether oligopoly firms are competing by price, the scenarios that they face are scenarios we would classify into this broad heading of prisoner's dilemma. And it's not only a fair wars or not only decisions on quantity that work very much like prisoner's dilemma. We can also think about decisions regarding advertising as working very much like a prisoner's dilemma. Firms may have a decision to advertise or not to advertise, or to advertise a lot or not to advertise a lot. And if both firms advertise a lot, they spend a lot of money on advertising, neither firm will be able to capture any additional customers from the competitor who's also advertising. So they might lose money as a result. They might spend a lot on the advertising, see very little, if any, increase in their demand. And if both firms did not advertise, they also would not have any effect on their demand, but they wouldn't be spending all that wasted money on advertising. However, if only one firm had decided to advertise, then that firm could capture a lot of the market, take a lot of customers away from the firm that did not advertise. And in that case, while they spend money on the advertising, the additional demand, additional revenues that they get would more than outweigh that, and they would be much better off. So this firm would prefer to spend a lot on advertising if their competitor did, because they wouldn't want to be so badly hurt losing all this demand. And that firm would prefer to advertise, spend a lot on advertising, if that other firm, their competitor, did not advertise, because they would like to take all that demand away from that competitor. So in one case, this firm in an advertising game, in one case, this firm would prefer to spend a lot on advertising in order to take customers away. And in the other case, with another strategy or decision followed by their competitor, this same firm would choose to spend a lot on advertising in order to protect their customer base and avoid losing demand. In both cases, they would be better off spending a lot on advertising than they would be not spending any on advertising. And their dominant strategy would be to spend money on advertising. However, if both companies spend a lot on advertising, there's a high cost of advertising, but there's no impact on their demand. And they're both worse off than both of them would have been if they hadn't spent anything on advertising. So we also say, in this case, this model is very much like a prisoner's dilemma. The outcome is bad for both parties when they both follow their dominant strategies. The outcome that would have been better for both is simply not sustainable. It's not a Nash equilibrium. That if one company had decided to not advertise and their partner decided to not advertise, either one of those companies would be unsatisfied in retrospect with their decision not to advertise. They would have preferred to advertise and taken customers away from the competitor. Now, before we move on from the prisoner's dilemma, to clarify, we talk a lot about the prisoner's dilemma being bad. Say the prisoner's dilemma leads to an outcome for Bonnie and Clyde, which is bad for Bonnie and Clyde. And Bonnie and Clyde would be better off if they both stayed silent instead of confessing. But it's not bad for society that people who rob a bank go to jail. In the same case, when we're talking about the prisoner's dilemma type scenario in oligopoly, we say that it's bad for both firms, that they both wind up charging a price by following their dominant strategy, which is lower than the price that would have been best for both of these oligopolistic firms. It's bad for those oligopolistic firms that we have this Nash equilibrium with low prices instead of high. But it is better for society. We're all better off being able to buy cheap airplane tickets as opposed to expensive ones. We're better off with cheaper cell phone service as opposed to more expensive cell phone service. And society is better off when more cell phone service is provided. Now, these firms are worse off by spending a lot of money on advertising instead of not spending a lot of money on advertising. And whereas the Fair Wars game, or that quantity competition game in small town example, those led to these prisoner's dilemma scenarios with an outcome which is worse for both oligopolists but better for society, lower prices, higher quantities. The ad wars game between oligopolists is worse for society as well, because these firms are charging higher prices, wasting society's resources by spending a lot of unnecessary money on advertising. It's not just in that case bad for the oligopolistic firm. In that case, it's bad for society as well. So don't imagine that when we look at any sort of prisoner's dilemma example, it's necessarily either good for society or bad for society, that we wind up with this Nash equilibrium, which is worse for both parties. There are other scenarios where we can look at certain phenomena as following a prisoner's dilemma type scenario, outside of economics, outside of oligopoly, outside of crime. One common example which was raised is military competition between superpowers. Military competition, or say, nuclear proliferation between military superpowers. And in that case, the outcome of our prisoner's dilemma is that both countries have the incentive to spend a lot on additional military hardware, spend a lot more on their military, whether their competitor does or not. Or they have a lot of incentive to build more nuclear missiles, whether their competitor does or their competitor does not. And this is another scenario in which the prisoner's dilemma outcome, that both countries or all countries spend far too much on their militaries, is clearly worse for society than the other outcome would be if they could somehow all agree not to spend all that money. Next, we've imagined in these prisoner's dilemma type examples, these game theoretical examples for oligopoly as well, a very simple scenario where the two parties make their decisions simultaneously and they do it only once. So this isn't a sequential game, so to speak, where you move and then I move, or AT&T moves and then Verizon moves. The outcome would be different in those cases. And this isn't a scenario in which AT&T and Verizon make one move and then another, and one move and then another, and one move and then another, and continue to play rounds of a game again and again and again and again. Now, if we were to change the game theoretical examples, that this game was repeated, and AT&T and Verizon made decisions every day about quantity, and they would continue to make those decisions about quantity every day for eternity, the outcome of the game theoretical example would be different. So even if we have a scenario which is clearly a prisoner's dilemma, which in a single shot, single period model, both parties have a dominant strategy to do something which is ruinous for both, such as produce a large rather than small quantity, or confess rather than refuse to confess. If we repeat this game infinitely, then it's possible to have what's called a trigger strategy. That is to say, if Verizon has a trigger strategy in this oligopoly game, and their trigger strategy is they will agree to collude, participate in that cartel, and hold to their agreements to produce 30 instead of 40, as long as AT&T continues to do the same thing. But to produce 40 and continue to produce 40 forever, if it's triggered by AT&T's cheating on the agreement. That can change what AT&T will prefer to do. So Verizon has a trigger strategy to produce 30 and not 40, only depending on what AT&T does, then AT&T can influence whether or not that strategy is triggered. And AT&T may have the incentive to continue to produce 30 in order to prevent Verizon from triggering this strategy and producing 40 in the future for perpetuity. AT&T would know that they could get some additional profit right now by producing 40 instead of 30 by cheating and not holding the agreement that they made with Verizon. But if they did that, they would be punished by Verizon because Verizon's strategy of producing 40 would be triggered. And then their profits for all future periods in this game would be reduced. They would be 750 instead of 900. And their profits for every period in this game would now be reduced. Their profits in every period in this game going forward would now be 800 instead of 900. Note, Verizon might have this trigger strategy and AT&T might have the same trigger strategy. And if both had this trigger strategy to collude until the other party cheats, then both of these parties could maintain collusion indefinitely, so long as they don't care so much about right now that they're willing to sacrifice the future to have a little bit more extra profit today. Now, because of that, it might not necessarily be all that easy to sustain this outcome indefinitely, because that outcome, that collusive outcome, where both of these parties produce the small quantity, they both collude, that operates on a hair trigger. And once it breaks down, it will break down forever. We could have something like a manager or CEO at one of these companies worrying about meeting some production target or profit target for the next quarter and sacrificing the future in order to do it. And then collusion breaks down. But we could at least imagine a scenario where this game is repeated indefinitely, again and again and again and again and again, where they could potentially cooperate. Next, we mentioned that oligopolies, like monopolies, do tend to result in a quantity of output which is lower than the optimal quantity of output for the market. And by producing too little, charging a price that's too high for it compared to what a perfectly competitive industry would do, we have less total surplus, we have deadweight loss. We have a market outcome which is worse than it could otherwise be. So there's an argument here for government to intervene to try to make these market outcomes better. Now, if our market is perfectly competitive, we said there was usually very little a government could do to intervene and make those outcomes better than a market outcome, more desirable. But if we have a monopoly or if we have an oligopoly because the price they charge is too high, there's a clear argument to be made for regulation. So much in the same case that a government may intervene in the case of a monopoly to increase the amount of competition, or a government may intervene in the case of a monopoly to regulate prices which may be charged. They could try to do these same things in the case of an oligopoly. So suppose we have barriers to entry, which cause our oligopoly to have only two firms. We could try to remove these barriers to entry to make it easier for additional firms to enter, causing more competition, causing, even if the number of firms is small, the number of firms to be larger, and therefore this oligopoly to behave more like a perfectly competitive industry would do. We could also, like in the case of a monopoly, force these oligopolies to charge a price equal to marginal cost, and thereby incentivize them to produce more because they no longer have the incentive to reduce the quantity that they produce in order to keep the price high. Since they can't keep the price high, the price could be regulated by the government. As these are possible solutions to monopoly problems, these are possible solutions to oligopoly problems. However, in the case of oligopolies specifically, what's usually the more important government policy is to restrict oligopolies' ability to collude, is to restrict cartel formation. So what we see around the world is that cartel formation or collusion between firms tends to be illegal and punishable by law. And we'll sometimes get examples in the news about chief executives from businesses in oligopolistic industries that have been found to be meeting behind closed doors and agreeing on what prices to charge. And then leaked recordings come out, and they're punished for these agreements that they made, secret agreements that they made to keep prices high. These things are made illegal by governments in order to limit the ability of oligopolists to collude, limit their ability to keep prices high. Now, economists generally agree that explicit price fixing among oligopolists is clearly bad and clearly should be prohibited. It's worthwhile for governments to intervene in those specific cases where there's clear evidence of price fixing. But a lot of actual potentially anti-competitive behavior that oligopolists engage in the real world isn't so clear-cut, isn't so obvious, is simply agreeing amongst themselves to charge a higher price. We're going to look at 3 examples of some potentially anti-competitive behaviors that oligopolists in the real world may engage in that economists don't necessarily agree that are worthwhile for the government to prohibit or to intervene to punish, and may not necessarily create more inefficiency or loss than benefit. The first of these kinds of practices that real-world oligopolists may engage in, that it's not as clear-cut, do damage to our economy, is what we call resale price maintenance. Now, this in a sense is price fixing, but it's price fixing by a manufacturer of a good with regard to the sale price that it can be sold for by retailers. So, as an example, if we imagine that Samsung engages in resale price maintenance on certain curved screen 4K televisions, they might set a price that retailers must charge for them being no lower than $3,000. Right? Retailers would be allowed to charge a bit more if they wanted to, but retailers would not be allowed to charge a price of, say, $2,500. Now, to the extent that this limits the competition between the retailers themselves, or the retailers are competing with one another for customers who might buy televisions from them, we could consider this to be an anti-competitive practice, fixing the price of that good. If retailers are happy with this, we could consider them to be engaging in an anti-competitive practice. But economists certainly don't agree about whether or not this is overall good for the economy or bad for the economy or worthy of some kind of government intervention to prevent. Now, the manufacturer might have some kind of market power at the wholesale level, or the manufacturer might have some kind of market power at the production level because they have a patent on this particular kind of 4K television. But market power doesn't really exist at the retail level. And the practice itself may have a legitimate objective in that they don't want some of these retailers. If some of these retailers have very small margins, some of these retailers give deep discounts on this product, they don't want that kind of discount retailer to free ride on the marketing that is engaged in by other kinds of retailers with larger store footprints and bigger showrooms that have higher costs and have to charge higher prices. If we have these two kinds of retailers, these showroom retailers and these discount retailers, the showroom retailers may give a lot of benefit through what I described as a marketing type expenditure for the manufacturer in making their good appear better and giving people a better opportunity to see how that good works. And the manufacturer may want to force discounters to charge the price which is the same as the showroom retailers do. Some economists would argue that overall that may be a good thing for the economy, even though it's clearly a bad thing for competition in the retail sector. The next example we want to look at for a potentially anti-competitive behavior that's engaged in by oligopolists is what we call predatory pricing. Now, just like discrimination doesn't mean something exactly what you might think it might mean in the context of economics, predatory pricing doesn't either. You might think of predatory pricing as meaning something like charging you a very high price and forcing you to buy the good and preying upon you, but that isn't what it means. Predatory pricing refers to a company charging a very low price in order to prey upon its weaker competitors. If a company is engaging in predatory pricing, they charge prices which are very low, so low that their competitors who might be smaller, who might be less financially stable, are not able to compete. They're either not able to charge prices that are that low, or if they do charge prices that are that low, they go bankrupt, they exit the market. And then when the firm that has charged these very low predatory prices has driven its competitors out of the market, then and only then they would raise their prices to a higher level and earn higher profits due to the reduced competition that they face. Now, if a firm is successfully able to do this, an oligopolist is successfully able to do this, they could potentially engage in predatory pricing in order to become a monopoly, or to become a local monopoly, a monopoly within a town, within a city. And that would, it seems, be bad for the economy, would reduce welfare, increase deadweight loss, because in the long run that would mean higher prices and lower quantities. So there is an argument to be made for rules to prevent predatory pricing, for punishments for predatory pricing. However, we may also see that a company tries to engage in predatory pricing, but by lowering the prices so low, they've increased surplus in that market, temporarily at least. They've increased the quantity that's being bought and sold in that market. And this initial phase, where they've lowered the prices in order to try to drive their competitors out of business, benefits consumers. It hurts the firm engaging in that predatory pricing, just like it hurts their competitors. And if they fail ultimately to drive those competitors out of business, then they'll ultimately be forced to raise their prices back up again. And all we would see as a result of predatory pricing is a temporary benefit for consumers, a temporary reduction in the deadweight loss that's associated with the oligopoly. We could also see that even if they succeed in driving those competitors out of business, they have to keep prices low in the long run and not raise them up to a high level like a monopoly would be able to charge in order to prevent other competitors from entering the market. Our last example of a potentially anti-competitive practice, which has come up in court battles over oligopoly and monopoly, is what we call tying or bundling. Tying and bundling refer to one firm with a dominant position in a single market tying purchase of another good in which they don't have a dominant position to purchase of the first good. This came up in the antitrust case against Microsoft, arguing that Microsoft was bundling other products together with its Windows operating system, where Microsoft had a monopoly in the Windows operating system, or something very close to a monopoly in that particular market. But it was bundling together other products in other product markets where Microsoft was not a monopoly, and Microsoft did not have a dominant position. And the argument was whether this tying or bundling should be illegal, whether this was an abuse of market power by Microsoft, and whether this should be banned, whether it was making our economy worse, whether it was reducing welfare for consumers or not. So some argue, critics of this argue that by tying and bundling goods together, the firm isn't ultimately changing market power. People aren't willing to pay more for Windows and some other product together than they would have been willing to pay for Windows and this other product apart. And the only reason that the market power exists is the problem of market power in the Windows market. So if there's going to be policy, going to be punishment, going to be some kind of regulatory solution to solve bundling, it should come about through trying to prevent the initial market power in the market for the good, which is bundled together with the second good. In conclusion, oligopolies are an intermediate sort of a market structure, and oligopolies can wind up behaving relatively more like a monopoly if they're able to collude well in a situation with a small number of firms. And they may end up behaving more like a perfectly competitive industry if we have many oligopolists, and those oligopolists have a very difficult time engaging in collusion. The outcome, either way, will be somewhere in between that outcome. For monopoly on one extreme, where we have a large deadweight loss, and a perfectly competitive industry on the other extreme, where we've maximized social welfare. And we can have a variety of different outcomes with differing levels of deadweight loss. Sometimes public policy may be able to be used to reduce the amount of deadweight loss that's associated with oligopoly, but it's not necessarily the case for all kinds of behaviors that oligopolies may behave in that it would be possible for public policy to solve the problem. Just as in the same case, in the case of monopolistic competition, it may not always be possible for governments to intervene to prevent the efficiency losses that result. Now, this wraps up this 5-lecture unit on market structure and the behavior of the firm. When we resume with lecture 15, we'll begin our units on macroeconomics.